Welcome back to another episode of the DDGeopolitics live stream, 2 days in a row, and we have a big panel for you guys tonight. I'm not even going to introduce them. We're just going to roll right into it. We have Carl Jia and Xiangyu. This is Carl's second time on the show. We have had a wonderful time in the past, and I'm really happy to finally meet Xiangyu after my producer has been hounding me to have him on for about 2 months. So here we are today. And because our listeners keep asking about Korea and reunification of the peninsula, we're going to talk about how Taiwan became the Ukraine for China and what that has to do with the Korean War and how it kind of developed out of that. So how are you guys tonight? Tonight for me. How are you guys this morning?
I thought you missed the opportunity to rename the title to be The Big Trouble in Little China.
I don't even want to talk about it. I didn't even realize it until we came here, and one of the listeners said it, and I was like, "Oh my god, I'm so disappointed." I always said Big Trouble comes in small packages, but then we changed it, and now I wish we would have said Big Trouble in Little China. But yeah, we're going to talk about Taiwan. Is it big trouble for Little China?
No, nothing significant has really changed over the past, I'd say, 7 to 8 decades, or even centuries.
We've been okay for about 80 years. So why don't you guys tell us about what kind of what the climate was like right after World War II, kind of segueing into the Korean War, which was actually, most people don't know in the West that it was actually a UN war. It wasn't an American, well, it was an American war, but it was disguised as a UN war to all of the other nations because they were war weary. So kind of what happened in China during the Korean War?
Well, it's actually important because the Korean War actually ties in to what happened to Taiwan, because because 1949 China was at the tail end of its civil war. Chiang Kai-shek's government had been defeated on mainland China. He withdrew to Taiwan with the rest of his nationalist army, but everybody was expecting Taiwan to fall. Like even many of the KMT officials, people on Taiwan, had expected the communist victory come to Taiwan sooner or later. But what changed was in June 1950, with the outbreak of Korean War, United States President Truman authorized the U.S. 7th Fleet to enter the Taiwan Straits, effectively intervene in a Chinese civil war. And that's what saved Chiang Kai-shek's ass on Taiwan. And that ended up with a separation for Taiwan from mainland China that remained till this day, 70 years separation. And go ahead.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Chiang Kai-shek? Because he was palling around with some of the European fascists towards the end of World War II. I believe he hung out with Franco. He definitely hung out with Bandera from Ukraine, and maybe even Ante Pavlich from. So was he really a fascist, or was it? What was his kind of political ideology, or maybe his platform?
I think Carl can get into it a little bit more, but I think during that time, in many parts of the world, fascism and communism were looked to as different alternatives and potential paths. And it says a lot that Chiang Kai-shek sent his biological son, Jang Keqing, to the Soviet Union to study for 12 years, while his adopted son was sent to Nazi Germany. So
yeah, I mean, Chiang Kai-shek has always been he's an opportunist, but he also liked to be fashionable. He was working with the Soviet Union in the early 1920s when Soviet Union sponsored KMT, and later when he made his break with the communists, especially after 1927 Shanghai massacre, where he purged 5,000 union workers, communists, sympathizers, anybody suspected to be communists in Shanghai. That's when he lost the support of the Soviet Union. So he turned toward Nazi Germany. China had a commercial relationship with Germany prior to Nazi coming to power, because Germany, after the Treaty of Versailles, their industry have been severely curtailed. I mean, their arms industry doesn't have a market, but China was in its warlords period, and it has a lot of demand for German weapons. So the German manufacturers got their ass saved by coming to the Chinese market and selling German weapons to China, and that relationship carried over when Hitler took power in Germany. And Chiang Kai-shek actually hired a German advisor from Nazi Germany to train KMT army. This was a time when he was waging the war on the communists. On Mao had established a base in southern China, so the German advisor to Chiang Kai-shek enabled the KMT multiple extermination campaigns against the communists. But Chiang Kai-shek is also admired of the ideology of Mussolini and then later Hitler, because he thought, okay, this could be one way of bringing China to consolidate China under his control, under his power. But he's not a really I remember there's a Chinese dissident at that time who said Chiang Kai-shek. Do you remember Xiangyu? He said 独裁无能，民主独裁无胆, and something. It's like basically saying he's too chicken. He's too chicken to go to become a full dictator. Like his idols. And in Nazi Germany, but it's also because China wasn't a centralized state the way Germany and Italy was. There were many warlords. He has to contend for power, and also there was a communist party. So this is kind of the in 1930s, 1920s, a lot of things were in flux, like Xiangyu referred to. People are flirting with all kind of different ideologies. Like the United States was a role model for Dr. Sun Yat-sen with the founding of the Republic of China. But what happened was during World War One, the United States wanted China to join the war on the Allied side because the Allies were running out of manpower. All the men were sent to the front, and they need people to man the factories. So both United States and UK want China to join on the war against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and what China did, what United States did was promise China that if they join the war on the Allied side, they will return the German Chinese colony of Qingdao back to China at the end of the war. But at the same time, United States made a deal with Japan that will allow Japan to take the German colony of Qingdao in China. So after World War One, there was a Treaty of Versailles. China sent its official representative to Versailles, and this is where Chinese interest was betrayed, because the prior agreement between United States and Japan, the German colony of Qingdao was given to Japan. Now this was revealed by the Soviets, because the Soviets, they inherited all the Russian archives, so they knew all the deals that happened between all the great powers. They knew the British and the French were dividing up the Middle East, and they knew that they're going to betray China and give the German colony of Qingdao to Japan. So they leak all the documents, and especially they leak all the secret deals to the Chinese representative in Versailles. And that news traveled back to China. It raised a huge protest on May 4th, 1919. And this is when a lot of the people, especially young people, got disillusioned with Western liberalism, and especially with their previous infatuation with the United States, and they started to seek alternative ideologies, and communism was one of them. A lot of the people, Mao, for example, were influenced by the May 4th movement. That's when the Chinese Communist Party started to be formed. Chiang Kai-shek was flirting with his own brand of, fascist ideology. But in 1940, to fast forward a couple of decades, at the end of the surrender of Japan in 1945, there was still a lot of area in China under Japanese occupation. Most of the Chiang Kai-shek's army, nationalist army, is camped in the southwest part of China, whereas the communists have established many rural bases all over China, especially in the northern China. They're closest to all the big cities that's still controlled by the Japanese Imperial Army. The United States has its own plans for the post-war East Asia. You wanted Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist China to act as a deputy for the U.S. empire, the way that later Japan picked up that role. But originally, Roosevelt's vision was for China to be U.S. junior partner in East Asia to hold off the Soviet influence. And the United States didn't want the communists to take over northern China. So what they did is they start shipping the U.S. after World War II. The largest military operation U.S. was involved in was called Operation Beleaguer. They sent 60,000 troops to China, including Marines and Navy. And their main goal was to help shipping Chiang Kai-shek's army from southwestern China to northern China, where they will take over from the surrendering Japanese army to race against the clock, against the communists. And at the same time, the Soviet, after August Storm 1945, the Soviet Union took over much of Manchuria from the Japanese Kwangtung Army. And the communists took the opportunity at this time to enter Manchuria to take over a lot of the administration, because Soviet Red Army has no interest in administering Chinese cities. So they hand over all the Chinese cities they control to the communist administration. And for both Chiang Kai-shek and United States, that was not acceptable. So U.S. started trying to ship nationalist troops to Manchuria. And this made Soviets set up and took notice, because before the end of the war, Stalin signed the Sino-Soviet Friendship Treaty in August 1945. And one of the stipulation is the Soviet will maintain the naval base in Port Arthur in the city of Dalian. And Soviet will have its trade privileges in Manchuria. When Soviets saw the U.S. 7th Fleet was shipping Chiang Kai-shek's forces closer and closer to Manchuria, Soviet felt like Chiang Kai-shek is becoming a U.S. proxy, and this is going to infringe upon the Soviet privilege in Manchuria. So they start to switch their support to the Chinese communists. That eventually led to the Chinese Civil War. This is kind of facet of early Cold War between U.S. and Soviet Union. The communists won out, and then the Chiang Kai-shek had to flee to Taiwan. So in 1949, the communists in China were still focused on restore, basically to chase out nationalists from all of Chinese territory. So their minds weren't even on Korea yet, but right, Korea has
helped, didn't they? Didn't they help the communists win the Civil War?
Well, what happened is when the Soviet came in at the end of the World War II in August 1945 during August Storm, the 1 million strong Red Army very quickly took over Manchuria, and they advanced into northern Korea. But United States had a prior agreement. So United States very quickly went to Soviet Union because they didn't want the Soviet to take over the entire Korean peninsula. So they actually went to the Soviets and asked them to stop at the 38th parallel. But Soviet agreed. Soviet agreed to the plan. The Soviet Red Army actually stopped at their 38th parallel. So what happened is below the 38th parallel, the southern half of the Korean peninsula was still occupied by the Japanese. They were to wait for the arrival of the Americans. And the Americans did arrive. Then this partition of Korea was supposed to be temporary. This wasn't just like partitioning of Germany after World War II. This, which is a very temporary, it was never intended to set up two different states on the Korean peninsula. And at that time, the Korean people themselves, they started organizing. There was attempt to set up the People's Republic of Korea. But United States government didn't like that. They quickly disbanded that government. Most of the people who were involved fled to north to form the government in Pyongyang. And the United States had found its own proxy, Syngman Rhee, to be the head of the South Korean government. Now, there was supposed to be an all-Korean election for a new government, but that never happened because United States wouldn't allow it. They want and people in the Southern Korea, they were expecting liberation from the Japanese and from the Japanese collaborators. So what happened was the Japanese left, but all the Japanese collaborators were left in place in the government, and so they were kind of bewildered. It's like, well, what happened? Well, where's the liberation? And this is when there were several maybe Xiangyu can pick it up from here. There were several uprisings in Southern Korea that were later was put down by the American proxies because they didn't want to see a unified Korea. They didn't want to. They wanted to prolong the occupation of Southern Korea. They wanted to making the partition into a permanent state of affair. But both North and both North and South Korean government in 1950, they want a unified Korea. They want a unified Korea under their own government. Syngman Rhee from the South, he wanted to unify. He wanted to push North to unify Korea under his rule, and North Korea, DPRK under Kim Il-sung, wanted to push South to reunify South Korea, to unify all of Korea under the communist rule. So the Civil War was already brewing before it officially broke out in June 1950. There were several uprisings in the South Korea that was brutally suppressed. And people like to say, oh, on June 1950, North Korea started Korean Wars. This is actually not true. Both sides were planning for a conflict that will see a unified Korea, which is a matter of time when the conflict breaks out. China did help because China had during the Chinese Civil War, there was one of the major battleground was Manchuria, and Manchuria had a several million Korean population, and from this several million Korean population, there were about 60,000 Koreans who signed up for the People's Liberation Army. And in 1950, when Kim Il-sung had his plan to reunify Korea, he approached Mao Zedong. He said, "Okay, I know you have 60,000 Korean soldiers in the PLA. They have helped to liberate China. Now we also like to have them to help liberate their homeland." And the deal was done that the 60,000 Korean soldiers from the People's Liberation Army then were transferred to DPRK. They became officially part of the Korean Army, and that boosted the military strength of DPRK to suddenly to over 100,000. And that they actually formed along with the Soviet Koreans, they formed kind of the backbone in the early phase of the Korean War.
So can you tell us a little bit about maybe, it's funny because we want to talk about Taiwan being the Ukraine of Asia. We entered into another Ukraine of Asia, which is South Korea, the forever occupied South Korea. I don't think that people understand that South Korea has no control over their military and is literally just a colony of the United States. Can you talk a little bit about Stalin's kind of hesitancy, and then he eventually sent the generals into North Korea for an advisory status, and he was still kind of like iffy, and then but then they got involved.
Well, I mean, Stalin wanted coexistence with U.S. after World War II because the Soviet Union have suffered greatly from a great loss of manpower. The Soviet Union wanted to concentrate on reconstruction of the Soviet Union. This is why Stalin made a lot of compromises all over the world, including Greece. From Greece Greece to Korea. I mean, this is why they decide to, okay, if the Soviet Red Army, if they wanted to, they could easily push further south in August, September of 1945. I mean, there was no resistance, but they abided by the agreement they had with Americans. You know, the Americans at the last minute, they realized, okay, if they don't stop the Soviet, if they don't tell the Soviet to stop, the Soviet just gonna take over the entire Korean Peninsula, and that threatens the planned occupation of Japan, because United States wanted to make sure Japan remain with its own sphere of influence post-war. And that later U.S. would include Taiwan as part of. In 1949, there was a debate between the U.S. military and the U.S. State Department. The U.S. military wanted United States to intervene in the Chinese Civil War on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek, because U.S. 7th Fleet had its headquarters in Qingdao after 1945. And they wanted to maintain their headquarters in China. They didn't want it, so they want U.S. to participate in the Chinese Civil War, just so the U.S. 7th Fleet can keep its headquarters in Qingdao. That didn't happen. The U.S. State Department actually was ready to abandon Chiang Kai-shek because they saw it was they saw it was a hopeless cause. But what they had planned a military coup on Taiwan to replace Chiang Kai-shek with a more pliant, a more pro-American military leader. They picked General Sun Lizhen, who studied in the West Virginia Military Academy, and he had him. Sun Lizhen actually met MacArthur in Japan shortly after, and MacArthur officially made him that offer. So, like, okay, we're thinking about making you the leader of Taiwan, replacing Chiang Kai-shek. Sun Lizhen didn't, he declined. But this news got filtered back to Chiang Kai-shek. So the Taiwan regime was on very rocky ground from the period of 1949 to 1950. But the Korean War changed that, because that's when suddenly the State Department and the U.S. Pentagon suddenly their vision got unified, and they decided they got to keep Taiwan from being controlled by the communists. MacArthur referred Taiwan as a unsinkable aircraft carrier, off the coast of China, and that's why United States intend to keep Taiwan under its control. And this is and at that time, the U.S. had got this anti-communist bug on its brain. Everything can be justified. So this led to the direct U.S. military intervention in the Korean Civil War. It's important to point that out. Korean War started out as the Civil War. U.S. is the one that decided to intervene in a civil war in Korea, and they got UN to authorize so-called UN forces, because at that time the Soviet walked out over I forgot what was the occasion. The Soviet representative walked out over a different issue at the time. So U.S. took the opportunity of the Soviet absence from the Security Council to push through the resolution to authorize the UN forces in Korea, and that's what happened.
And I want to ask Xiangyu, because he mentioned prior to when we started that his family actually has familial ties to the Korean War. So what can you tell us about your family, how they got involved, and what you know about kind of their experiences there?
Well, they weren't there to fight in the war, that's for sure. My paternal grandfather was from Shandong province, which was very impoverished when he was born, because he was born on the final year of the Qing dynasty, because he didn't have my dad until he was 50. Anyways, it was very popular at the time for people in Shandong to become migrant workers and go to China's northeast to be migrant workers and do hard labor. And at that time, the Northeast and Korea were under Japanese occupation. So some of them ended up trying to seek opportunities in Korea, where there also was a Chinese community, mostly from Shandong. So they would just fit right in. So he and his brother went to Hecheon and Chagang province, which is in North Korea. And then sometime before 1945, my grandfather went to Seoul, and he worked there as he was a woodworker, and then eventually became some sort of merchant. But fun fact, if you see a lot of brick buildings in South Korea, a lot of them were built by Chinese migrant workers hired by the Japanese during the Japanese colonization. So the war broke out. I mean, after 1945, my grandfather couldn't go back to Korea because there was the 38th parallel there, and he lost contact with his older brother for the rest of his life. But we're back in contact now because the Chinese community is pretty tight knit, and our relatives on mainland China ended up looking for them. So his older brother's family in Chagang in North Korea had their entire town bombed by the U.S. So they went in hiding, and they were found by the Chinese People's Volunteers. And when the volunteers found out that they were Chinese, they were like, "Hey, you need to go back to China." So they began their journey back to China on foot for like a whole month on foot, I think, or more. And they could only move at night because anything that moved during the day was fair game for U.S. bombings. And what really changed my mind about the Western media's portrayal of the Korean War when I was a late teenager was how, I mean, my grandfather, I never met him because he passed away before I was born, but he never was that political. He wasn't a communist sympathizer or anything. He was just a Chinese dude who was bitter about not ever being able to go back to China. So yeah, I mean, he and my dad would sometimes, because they want to hear news from home, so they would go and listen to shortwave radio at night in secret. This was very risky to do in South Korea at the time, to listen to broadcasts from mainland China, from Beijing, to kind of just keep up with what's going on back home. And of course, they would also get some North Korean broadcasts. But my dad eventually told me that my grandfather told him that during the Korean War, the Korean People's Army and the Chinese People's Volunteers were helpful to the people and did not interfere with their daily lives, whereas the Americans were very intrusive. Yeah, so that was kind of a huge turning point in my political development, hearing that side of the story from somebody who's not even a communist. Now, I think earlier on in our conversation, it's something I want to get back into, was how, understandably, when you wanted to talk about, hey, let's talk about Taiwan, you began the conversation by asking questions about Chiang Kai-shek, which is understandable. But I think the reason why I started my podcast called Straight Talk with Xiangyu is because I really want to let people know that to understand the geopolitics in this region, you cannot look at Taiwan's beginning as 1949 or even 1945. I'll give an example. Why did China enter the Korean War? I mean, it's not like something similar hadn't happened in the past. If you look at the first Sino-Japanese War, which resulted in China losing Taiwan to the Japanese in the humiliating Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, it was largely a war fought between Chinese and Japanese forces on Korea. I mean, some of the fighting happened elsewhere, but a lot of the fighting happened in Korea. So Korea serves as a land bridge for Japan or the Western powers into the Eurasian continent. Whereas Taiwan, if you look at a map, it's part of a huge island chain. It's right dead in the middle of the chain that starts in the Aleutian Islands all the way down to the South China Sea, looping back up to Southeast Asia. So the U.S. keeping control of Taiwan is integral for maintaining its encirclement of China, because if Chinese reunification happens, then that means China has unfettered access to the Pacific Ocean. So even in 1949, before the establishment of the People's Republic of China, so that happened in October, all the way back in February, when the writing was on the wall that the KMT would lose control over the mainland, they were already some factions of the U.S. I mean, like Carl mentioned, there were some disagreements within the U.S. government internally, but on how to reckon with the situation, how to approach the new incoming Chinese government, how to like how to make sense of it. And the consensus at that point was we just got to do whatever we can to keep Taiwan from being under control of the communists. And so in February, the U.S. sent a diplomat. He was sent by the then Secretary of State Atchison. I think his name was Livingston T. Merchant. He was sent to Taiwan to talk to the provincial governor, Chen Cheng, and he offered him a deal saying, hey, if you declare independence, separate yourself from the central government and on the mainland, declare a separate country, we'll support you, and then we will send in UN forces, and then we'll do a little national foundation ceremony. And then when Chiang Kai-shek loses the civil war, he has to come to Taiwan as like a separate Taiwan that's separate from China as a political refugee, and not, what happened, which was Chiang Kai-shek came to Taiwan with Taiwan being the last stronghold of China that hadn't fallen to the communists. You see the difference there?
Correct.
So,
yeah. I kind of ask how we got a foothold there, but that makes sense as kind of like being like, we'll keep this island out of the sphere of the PRC.